President's Day was established in honor of our first president, George Washington. And since he had such a history in Fredericksburg, let's see all of the things Washington here in Fredericksburg. Just across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg is Ferry Farm, George Washington's boyhood home, where he lived with his 4 siblings. His father died when he was 11 years old, and his mother, Mary, never remarried. I'm at the home of Mary Washington, the mother of George Washington. George bought his mother this house in 1772 because she was still living at Ferry Farm across the river, and he wanted her to be closer to her son Charles and her daughter Betty, who lived nearby. The house was originally 2 separate houses. He bought the 2 houses and then he built the one in the middle for her. A visit to Mrs. Washington in her home became a regular stop for distinguished visitors to Fredericksburg. Among those stopping by to pay their respects were John Marshall, George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, Marquis de Lafayette, and members of the Lee family. I'm on the corner of Caroline and William Street, and this used to be Whedon's Tavern. George Washington called it his second home. He was there so much. The owner of it was George Whedon, who was his friend in the French and Indian War. Many ledgers in Washington's journals during the early 1770s listed dining with political dignitaries and officers of the militia. When Washington won the Battle of Yorktown, a veritable who's who of American and French officers, politicians, wealthy planters, and foreign dignitaries attended a party at Whedon Tavern. George Washington attended, as did the Marquis de Lafayette, as he arrived arm in arm with Washington's mother. George Washington also noted that he lost many a card game here because he said the Fredericksburg people were just too smart for him. George's younger brother Charles lived here on Caroline Street, and he was George's biggest supporter. He was the first one to vote for George when he ran for the House of Burgesses. His son, George Augustine Washington, was also in the Revolutionary War, and his uncle made him an aide to the Marquis de Lafayette. Charles later moved to West Virginia, and Charlestown is named after him. I'm at the home of Betty Washington Lewis, the sister of George Washington. She married Fielding Lewis, and in 1772, they built this house. Fielding Lewis was the businessman in Fredericksburg and bought 1,300 acres here. And George Washington, at the age of 20, surveyed 861 of those acres. The Lewises gave all of their wealth for the Revolution in procuring all of the munitions for the army against the British. Some say that Fielding Lewis is buried underneath the front steps of St. George's Church. It's probably a myth, but we do know he was a vestryman here, and George Washington's wife Martha, her father, is buried here. This is the gravesite of George Washington Lewis, the son of Fielding and Betty Lewis, Betty being the sister of George Washington. So General George Washington was his uncle. He went to Princeton at 13 years old, and then at the age of 19, he joined in the Revolutionary War. George Washington Lewis was also on his uncle's staff during the Revolutionary War. He was with him when he crossed the Delaware for the Battle of Trenton. And then during the Battle of Princeton a week later, he was with his fellow Fredericksburger, General Hugh Mercer, while he died. Catherine, his wife, is next to him, and he fell in love with her during the Revolutionary War. He actually left his post to be with her, and he got a very stern letter from his uncle, General George Washington, to come back to his post because it would make his family name look bad. Though young George Washington started his schooling across the river in Falmouth, in his early teens, he was taught at the corner of Amelia and Caroline at this spot, where now the Fredericksburg Baptist Church stands, by the Reverend James Mary. The Fredericksburg Masonic Lodge is one of the most historic and oldest in all of the Commonwealth of Virginia. It has existed since 1752. All of the Fredericksburg Revolutionary War heroes belong to this lodge. The original painting of George on the $1 bill is cared for by this lodge. 1783, 2 months after the Treaty of Paris was signed ending the war against the British, General George Washington was a private citizen and he came to Fredericksburg to visit his mother and his family. While here, he was honored by the mayor, and Washington himself spoke these words. I have a great place and my sincere praise for the happiness and success of Fredericksburg. So I hope you enjoy this video on George Washington and his family in Fredericksburg. Share it with anybody who might be interested. Enjoy your history. This is Norman Voss. See you next time.